Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar. This is Crow Canyon Software. This is Scott Restivo with Crow Canyon Software, and we're happy to have Stephanie Donahue and Mark Rackley here to present a session on transforming your organization into a digital workplace. Stephanie and Mark are both MVPs. They work with the PATE group, and they'll go into more detail in that when they start their presentation. Crow Canyon is an Office 365 and SharePoint application development company. We have out-of-the-box business solutions that are used by organizations worldwide. These run in SharePoint and Office 365, and they include such things as help desk, IT asset management, facilities, equipment, purchasing, HR requests, contract management, a whole variety of critical business applications that run in the SharePoint and Office 365 world and are used throughout the world by organizations and help the businesses run more efficiently and improve production and benefits to use in Office 365 and SharePoint. That's part of what Stephanie and Mark will emphasize today, is how Office 365 and SharePoint can be used for digital transformation, as the buzzword goes, and how these applications running in those environments can provide increases in productivity and streamline operations. Crow Canyon also has a Nitro Studio, we call it, which is a no-code application development environment for Office 365 and SharePoint. It consists of a set of apps and web parts and can be used to develop whether simple or complex applications on those platforms, such as using forms, workflows, reporting, different kind of custom columns like cascading lookups and branding and email synchronizations, and all kinds of tools that we found in our application development world to be very important to be core components of these business applications. So Crow Canyon has the out-of-the-box business applications ready to go for people who don't want to do any real development on top of it. Then for business users and power users, we have this Nitro Studio no-code development platform that can be used. If you're interested in any of those, you can contact us at www.crowcanyon.com. And that's, I just wanted to present a little bit about Crow Canyon, but most important is to introduce Stephanie and Mark so they can take over and give their presentation. Hope you all enjoy it. One thing I do want to point out about the webinar is that if you do have questions, there is a box you should see in your screen there, the GoToWebinar screen, that says questions. And if you put them in there, we'll try and answer them during the webinar. If not, we'll get to them after. We're glad to keep in communication with you and have this somewhat interactive. I know webinars aren't particularly interactive, but if we can, we'll make them interactive, talking about any questions you might have. And also, both Crow Canyon, myself, I'm Scott Restivo, and Stephanie and Mark are available. We will communicate you by email. If you have any questions, we're glad to continue the discussion after the webinar. With that said, I'd like to change the presenter and introduce Stephanie and Mark and have them go forward. You guys ready?
All righty, let's go.
All right, here you go.
Thanks, Scott. All right.
Yeah, go ahead. Share your screen. Okay, there you go.
Looks like it's showing. Scott, can you verify you can see the slide?
Yes, there it is. It's full screen. Looks good.
All righty. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm Stephanie Donahue, and I'm here with Mark Rackley. Mark, say hello.
Hello.
There you are. We are here today to talk about a digital transformation story. This is a real world story of a customer that we took from kind of legacy environment, legacy SharePoint, legacy intranet, all the way into Office 365, and kind of over a couple of years, how we help them transform their organization, transform the way that they work every day. We thought it was a pretty cool story. It's exciting, it's fun, lots of different pieces and parts to it, and we thought that would make for a great story and a great webinar to share with you. I know it's kind of sometimes discouraging to think, oh gosh, we're so far behind or we're so disorganized, and I hear that all the time from our customers. So this is just a story about how you can get there too, because everybody kind of starts from a different place, and this organization in particular, global manufacturing firm, really had a long way to go from where they started to where they are now. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And as Scott mentioned, if you have questions, please jump into the question window between Scott and Mark and I. Hopefully we'll be able to address your questions. Anything we don't get to, we'll try to address after the webinar. We'll just see how things go here. So, all right. So real quick background on Mark and myself. Again, I'm Stephanie Donahue with Pay Group, and my personal background, I do a lot with Office 365 strategy, governance, and site architecture. Kind of an IT pro from way back though. I've been using SharePoint for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. I used to support the server side of things. I've done plenty of migrations in my time, so I've definitely felt the pain of kind of going from one version of SharePoint to the next for quite some time now. I am a Microsoft MVP, and Mark and I both are. That means we get to interact with Microsoft directly and provide feedback and give them information as well as get information from Microsoft as well. So you can also find me out on the Pate Group blog as well as my personal blog and Twitter. I'm going to hand things over to you, Mark.
All right, so my name is Mark Rackley, and I am Stephanie's business partner at Pate Group, and I've come from the development side of the house. I've been writing and architecting software for over 20 years now, and I'm also a blogger, writer, and speaker. I developed a free form solution for you guys that hate InfoPath as much as I do, called Stratus Forms, so check that out. I also, Stephanie and I are both part of a podcast called Techsplaining, so if you want to subscribe to our podcast, it's at techsplaining.net, and you can hear our ramblings about all things around SharePoint Office 365 and how it impacts your organization. So if you go to the next slide, Stephanie.
Yep, I'm getting there, sorry. Right. Oh, there we go.
So something else that's coming up, and in fact it's coming up next week, is we are actually organizing a conference in Branson, Missouri called the North American Collaboration Summit, and all you guys are invited. In fact, if you want 50% off registration, you can use the promotion code of Crow Canyon, and that will get you registration for only $32.50. This is a community-based conference. We have 50 speakers coming in from all over the world. About 20 of those speakers are international SharePoint MVPs because they're on their way to the MVP Summit at Microsoft the following week, so they thought they would come and stop in Branson and say hi to us. It's a great 2-day conference. It's a lot of fun, and I hope you guys can be there. So a little backstory into what we're talking about with this organization that we were brought into to help them transform. This is an older manufacturing company, like Stephanie said, and with that there comes some baggage, right? They had a lot of legacy, homegrown, outdated systems that were, not modern in any way. It's stuff that they had to upgrade at some point, which meant that it didn't interact with a lot of different other things. It was just a pain to maintain. They were running out of people that could actually know how they worked. And they also had a lot of non-technical stakeholders. As a manufacturing company, this company made car foam for the seats in cars. It's like there's a whole industry around this, which kind of blows my mind. But it's a non-technical stakeholders. So they see IT as that necessary evil, not something that they're going to get excited about. And I remember having one of our first conversations about building their intranet, and one of the stakeholders in the room literally stopped the meeting. He said, wait a second, what's the difference between an internet and an intranet? So we actually had to take a few steps back there and really help these guys understand some of the technicalities of what we're working on. This is a global organization, so they had plants all over the world. So we had to figure out how we're going to plan for communications to all those different plants. They also had great retention, which means a lot of older people working, a lot of people who don't like change, a lot of people who are more than happy to maintain that Excel spreadsheet with hundreds and hundreds of rows, or know exactly which folder to go to in the share drive to find the file they're looking for. So they don't need no stinking SharePoint, right? So there's a lot of staff there who liked the way things were. And on top of all this, they were extremely budget minded, like most companies are. They didn't want to spend a dime more than they had to. So we had to think about how we could take the organization and transform it with all of these things in mind.
So as we began working with them, Mark, What do you think was the big spark for them?
Well, the thing is, within any organization that's this size, that don't like technology, that don't see it as that necessary evil, you've got to have something that's going to make them pay attention. And for us, there was one of the directors of IT. He had this idea of transforming the organization, and so he became our champion, and he became the key to making this company start to move forward.
All right. Well, so what we started doing with this group, right? We started educating. So that's probably one of the biggest things. That's why you're probably on this webinar today, right? We had kind of a long way to go. They, like Mark said, they didn't know intranet versus internet, and all they knew was what they had there in front of them. The great thing about retention in an organization is that you have people that have in-depth knowledge about the organization itself, but maybe hadn't had exposure to newer technologies. They didn't even have a messaging system, an instant messaging system within the organization. So they didn't even know what was there. So we spent a lot of time educating on the possibilities, generating excitement, really kind of working on building ideas around mapping what they do as an organization into the technology itself. And so we had to spend a lot of time kind of, I think it was what, like 18 months we spent talking, educating,
Yeah.
figuring out what that next win was going to be, because we couldn't just come in and implement technology for the sake of technology. We needed to come in and really figure out what made sense for them, what was going to resonate, because they didn't care about the technology. They just want to get their job done. So we kind of had to figure out what is it that's going to resonate, what's that key, what's that spark that we're going to get things moving with. And something else we did, I know budgets are kind of one of those pieces. Well, we would do it if we had the budget for it. I do encourage you, there's sometimes funding available through Microsoft, and that funding might help you get jump started sometimes. There's Fast Start or Fast Track, I think, through Microsoft. They can help you kind of get that initial push moving forward. So that was something else that helped us kind of get things moving there for them. But we had one failed SharePoint online attempt previously. It was a different vendor. Like Mark said, they had the change resistant staff, and it did take us a very long time to get everyone kind of comfortable with kind of where we wanted to take things. It was a big jump for them, a big thing for them to understand. And so we were looking for that one thing, that one, what is going to be that one really big idea that was going to get this moving forward throughout that education process. And what we were finding, we needed to find other executives who had successfully used Office 365, maybe joint venture partners, other people that top level was familiar with, so that they could go get that feedback from other organizations. And what ended up happening there, we were researching, desperately trying to find, proof, essentially, that this group could do an implementation much like somebody else and be successful. And what we found was a case study published on the Microsoft site, and it ended up being a joint venture company of theirs that had done an Office 365 implementation, and they had used, at the time, Office 365 Video. You might notice Stream now, things are transitioning into Microsoft Stream. And this partner had gone out to the manufacturing plant floor. They had used video to be able to record quality issues out on the plant floor, and that could be uploaded into Office 365, and now a quality issue out in one remote manufacturing plant could then be discussed worldwide. They could come up with a solution and collaborate on the platform. And ding, that was what set the light bulb off for our executive team. It wasn't, fancy things with SharePoint or anything with Exchange. It was something that hit right to the heart of their organization. It was their manufacturing plants and quality issues, because that's what costs the company money. Millions of dollars every year, right? Or thousands, or it depends on the size of your organization. But hitting something like that helped them understand how powerful this platform was. And that's all it took, 18 months of trying and explaining and mapping issues to technology. And that was the one thing. Gosh, if we had found that earlier, right? But definitely go out and talk to others and figure out what is it that you're doing that others are doing that you could learn from them. Go out and find case studies, figure out what that piece is, because for this organization, it was the beginning of a massive transformation that allowed us to bring all of these needs that they had, their quality issues and their communication issues, and bring it all under one security umbrella. Get rid of all those third-party applications and really bring that into Office 365 and give them a very secure place to collaborate and improve their processes overall. It's pretty exciting to see that spark go off for them. So what had happened with this organization then, we had to come in and kind of prove ourselves, right? So they said, oh, that's great, 365 is wonderful, but we already kind of had this other implementation, right? And this other implementation didn't go so well, and it was in SharePoint. And I think, they kind of, Mark, maybe you could explain this part of it. I know you were kind of right in the middle of this here with the failed application.
Yeah, so what happened is what typically happens when you bring in a vendor, and this was a large vendor that wanted to come in there, do the job, and leave and get paid for it. So they never really took the time to understand what were the true business needs. They looked at the requirements and then implemented those requirements without actually understanding what did the business need. Is this going to actually meet their needs? And so when we came into the organization, we looked at this application and we're like, we can rebuild this and we can make this better. And they're like, oh, no, you're just saying that because you're a consultant. We're like, no, really, we can talk to you, we can listen to you, and we can help make this application better. And Stephanie will go to the next slide. I'll show you, we'll start to talk about exactly what that looked like. So when we got into this application, it really was, it was a mess. It was done in SharePoint Online. And what would happen is this consulting firm had created more than 200 content types for this single application, with over 200 SharePoint groups that they had to manage and maintain. And all of these groups were then in 13 document libraries, and each one of those document libraries had 25 folders, and every single one of those folders had unique permissions. So anytime you wanted to add a new department or something, you'd have to go through and add, I think, 13 different content types, 13 different groups, and then add those to each of the 25 folders, and it would take days just to add a new department. And they set up this really complicated structure, all of this, and it was just for less than 500 files. So if you think about that, they spent, I don't know how much money these guys spent to implement this really convoluted, complicated structure for less than 500 files. And so some of the screens that they would look at, like, this is a screen that the user would actually use to find their document. They would see all of these folders for their different departments. So, and you've got these three-letter abbreviations. What does COM mean? What does CRD mean? Right? Unless you know what these abbreviations mean, you don't know where you're looking for your document. And this just goes on and on. The page they would go to when they went to a department, I'm using air quotes for those people who can see department, it would look like the screen you're seeing here with just list views upon list views upon list views of documents. So no easy way to find their documents. Duplicates of documents everywhere. I mean, people, it was really unusable. And again, it was just for 500 documents. So like I said, we came in there and we said, hey guys, we can improve this. And they're like, yeah, whatever, you're just saying that. And I'm like, no, really, I promise we can improve this. So when we went through, we re-engineered this application. And what we did is we changed it to where everything was one content type. So instead of having to maintain over 200 content types, we reduced it down to one content type. And then instead of using subfolders in those different document libraries for security, which was just an unwieldy mess to maintain, we ended up creating a different site for each department. And that way security is separated by the site, easier to give people access to without getting crazy with forgetting where you added them to folders. And then we took all of those content, all that content from all those different sites, and we surfaced the documents to them in one search results page. So now instead of having to figure out which department your document's in, clicking 10 times, you would go to one page and use SharePoint search to find the document you're looking for. So we got this working, and they said, yeah, that's great, but we want a landing page. I'm like, what are you talking about? We've given you exactly what you asked for. It works great. And the executives are like, no, we want something pretty. I'm like, it's search. What do you mean you want something pretty? So I remember rolling my eyes. I'm thinking, okay, begrudgingly, we thought, what can we do to give these guys a landing page? So what we did is we used SharePoint search. And since each one of the documents each department was within its own site, we used SharePoint search to say, hey, search, bring me the names of all the sites for this search, and let's put a tile on that site. So now when you go to this new search page, the first thing you see is a nice landing page with tiles on it and a different tile for each department. So you can visually see the department you're looking for. And whenever the user clicked on that department, it would automatically filter the search results by that department to help them quickly find the department they're looking for. And again, this is something I didn't think was a big deal, but as soon as they saw this, like, oh yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for. That's perfect. And I'm just, okay, whatever.
Yeah, it's worth noting too, Mark took a very developer-centric approach to that. I'm personally not a developer, and we have plenty of customers that aren't developers. You could just use the promoted links web part, very much the same thing, right? Or just a basic image with a link attached to it. So there are ways. You don't have to know jQuery, you don't have to be a developer, but you can very much come up with a very similar approach to this. Something that really resonates with the users, I'm going to zoom in on that here real quick. There's something called visual rhetoric, and it refers to how a user feels when they look at something. And when a person looks at something, you want to, when you look at SharePoint, you think, oh, SharePoint is so ugly. People they just don't like it, right? That's why the new modern sites are out. We'll get to that in a minute. But being able to put something visual in front of someone makes them feel comfortable. It helps them understand, what am I clicking on? By looking at a picture, I'm very comfortable with the fact that I'm clicking on money, it's finance, that makes sense to me, I understand where I'm going, right? And we're very visual now. We have all this social media, Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter. Everybody uses images in every ounce of marketing in every piece of our life now. And so all we're doing is taking a very simple concept and putting it into SharePoint, helping users feel comfortable with the site. And that usability factor absolutely spikes your user adoption. And it's something to really consider as you're implementing the site. It's more than just being functional. It's providing users with something that they feel comfortable with, that they can use on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, another thing that was nice about this is because we were using search to create those tiles, whenever they created a new department site because they needed to add more documents for a new department, search would automatically pick that up and automatically add a tile to them on that landing page, so they didn't have to do any additional work. They could just create the site, add their content, and it was already ready to go. So like I said, whenever a user clicks on one of those tiles, it takes them to a search results page where we've already filtered the search results by the department they clicked on and by the language of their tenant. So we detect if they are configured for English or Spanish, and then we'll automatically filter the search results to show for the department and their language all the documents they can choose from. And then we like to explain that we've turned search into much like shopping for a product on Amazon. We've got all of their policies and procedures here, and now they can simply filter it down to exactly what they're looking for, whether they're looking for a training program or a guideline or a form. And so they can enter search in the search box to search the contents of documents. So we made it extremely simple for them to have one place to go to find all their documents across all their departments. And it worked out really well. They liked the way it worked. They are very engaged by it. And this was a nice first win for this organization and for us being in that organization.
Now that we had a win within the organization, it gave us a little bit better footing to go back out, because this was policies and procedures. So that hit every corner of the organization. And now all of a sudden, SharePoint had a good name, right? And so that gave us some momentum to build on to say, what's next? How do we go out? How do we hit the next big thing for them? And so we wanted to use that to kind of build a longer term strategy, define some goals, and we call that deployment planning. We sit down and we start, all those conversations that we had during that education phase, we can now start to line up into a roadmap. We can say, okay, what's next? What's the next phase? How does this set us up, and what comes after that phase? And what do we look like in 6 months? And so we were able to really start setting dates, to understand the gaps that they had in the organization, to implement new features in Office 365. And now we are set up really well for the next big win. And for this global organization, they said, we absolutely need help with communications. If you can fix that, we will be thrilled. With that, we kind of backed our way in, right? We did policies and procedures first, and then we went back and did the homepage, which may seem backwards, but that's just how it was there. We hit something very functional and very core to the importance of what they needed on a day-to-day basis for policies. And now we came back and we gave them a homepage that everyone could relate to. And this homepage is, you'll see the video embedded there. Again, video playing another really important part of their communication strategy. This was Office 365 video. They eventually transitioned that into stream. They can now play CEO town halls to everyone globally. Now upper management has a way to communicate with everyone in the organization, even if they didn't make it to that town hall because maybe they weren't available during that time. Very easy to get to. They have the whole list of announcements, which now we're not only focused at corporate, but they're now focused at a global level. So they have all of those available. And then they have all of the links, those colored square boxes here on the left. That'll get them into other areas of the site that were super important. And we put them kind of in a hybrid mode where we were still linking back to some of their old legacy applications, but we were also starting to transition to the new ones. For example, that policies and procedures library that we just talked about was linked here on the homepage as well. And we took a fairly unique approach to this. Mark, why don't you tell us how the site itself was built?
Yeah, so everything you're seeing on this page is, again, built off of search. So this gave us the ability to extremely personalize the experience that the user was seeing. So those tiles that we have on the left there are actually being shown based upon who you are within the organization. So if you don't care about the program launch calendar because of your job, you won't see that tile on left-hand nav. So we're able to show the news that corresponded to you, and this made people, it showed them exactly what they needed to show. And one of the things that I like to point out is, if you notice, we've started doing all this stuff in phases. We didn't go in there and do everything at once. We said, let's find those wins. Let's do this in a phase. So our first phase of this intranet was to really get them a personalized communication experience. And then from there, we were able to move to the next phase of the intranet.
Now, Mark, this is Scott. Can I interject something here?
Sure.
Now, there's a lot of intranet in a box developers and that kind of thing, programs out there. This is something that's not an intranet out of a box or connected to. Did they have another intranet in there in the organization that this connected to, or is this kind of a standalone? I'm just wondering if this was part of a larger intranet implementation.
Well, this was the first. Go ahead, Stephanie.
So this was part of the transition from their legacy intranet. So we did have side by side a legacy intranet as well. That intranet had been around for 15 years, and we took the core functionality of that, which was the announcements, and that's what got moved into Office 365. The long-term plan and what's completed now at this time, here we are a couple more years later, they've transitioned that entire intranet into Office 365 at this time. So for a while, they did have both side by side, but it is now 100% transitioned to 365. Mark, I'll let you comment on the technology behind it here.
I already did it, search.
Yeah, it's not like a
well, there was no internet in a box, though. That was my point. Sorry.
There are internet in a box solutions out there that can help you get a jump start on some of these things, but we did not use any third-party tools to do this. This was all using SharePoint's content search web parts and some, I think that's the majority of this page is some content search web parts strategically placed with display templates to give them the results they want. So it was done with very Very low drag is the term people like to use, and it's also very easy to maintain and update.
Cool. Okay, good. All right.
Yeah,
Just wanted to ask that.
it's also worth noting they spent quite a bit of time preparing their user profiles in Active Directory because their source of the truth for their employee information was an external HR system. And so what they ended up doing was exporting from that system and importing into Active Directory so that they could have all of that information, meaning the titles, the location of the user, and what that allows us to do is expand on that personalization piece that Mark referred to, so that search will only give you what applies to you. And so you can use metadata tags and search and security to provide a more relevant homepage using search-based web parts. So the user profiles was a huge piece of this that kind of, you can't even see the result on the screen, but it was a lot of work on the back side just to make sure that all of that synced up and that we could really target the users correctly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So based on who's logged in, it might show different screens, right?
Yeah,
Different elements.
absolutely. Different pieces of the same screen, right? And that was one thing that was important to them, was to have the same interface. Someone in the field or in the manufacturing plant should have access to some of the same information as corporate in the same view. They shouldn't be treated as different, but at the same time, they do have differing needs and things that are important to them that may not apply to corporate and vice versa.
Okay, good. Sounds good.
So our key takeaways in this portion, the targeting and personalization, obviously a really big, important piece. The branding and the impact there was, I feel good when I log into the site. I understand it. I know how to use it. It looks attractive. You know, it wasn't, oh, it's SharePoint. It was, oh, this is a new intranet. And we used user profiles to help target information so they cared about the dynamic content that was coming in. We used it to address the pain point of the communication lags that were happening from corporate out into the manufacturing plants. That hit their key #1 item that they needed to address in order to make this successful. And then as a result, we had a lot of top-down support. And what I mean by that is we now have executives paying attention, right? They say, wow, this is great. I have a way to communicate with my employees, and they have a way to get information kind of as they need it. They can come into the site and get information from us. So that was just it was a really big impact to the organization to take what we did with policies and procedures, to build on that and to give them a communication platform. And that's really when things took off for us. So the next piece here, the next phase, building on what we had done, we then started implementing languages. Also important to them, these remote manufacturing plants, many of them did speak English, but maybe was not their first language. And so being able to surface translated content to them, again, giving them a comfort level, logging into the site, helping them feel comfortable that they can know and understand what's in there. They're getting the same messaging that corporate users are getting, but they can do it in a way that feels good to them. And Mark, why don't you talk about the language component here as well?
Yeah, so one of the things, and one of the key components here to the language is that we could not do machine translation for this company because a lot of their announcements were things like changes to a manufacturing process because of a quality issue. And you would not want to rely on machine translation for that, because if that was translated incorrectly, it could be really disastrous for your manufacturing company. So the way this worked is with all of the content that's being shown on the homepage, the links on the right, the videos, and the announcements, there's an additional metadata tag for that content indicating what language that is in, what language is this announcement in, what language is this tile for. And they had people who would actually go through and verify the translations and make sure they were all accurate. And we were able to then just simply update our search. Instead of saying, bring me all the things that I have that are relevant to me, it's now bring me all the things that are relevant to me in my language. So with a very simple change, we were able to turn the homepage you saw before into a multilingual homepage. And we didn't use variations. We didn't make this messy. It's like, you know, we went to the client and said, what do you guys really need? Do you really need a full-blown multilingual, everything in SharePoint multilingual site, or do you need a communications landing page that is multilingual, maybe a couple other pages that are multilingual? And that's really what they needed. They didn't need all of SharePoint to be multilingual. They didn't need full-blown variations. They needed a few pages. So using search and some metadata, we were able to deliver that with pretty easily, actually. We also used a third-party tool here called Icefire to help us with some of the things like the navigation and things like that, to get some more of those pieces translated. But a majority of what you're seeing here is done basically with search.
And we implemented, I think, 2 additional languages. I think since then they have implemented an additional 2 languages. So I thought that was pretty cool too, that we were able to help them get kind of set up and get the template going, help them understand it, and then they were able to go and implement on their own based on the documentation that was provided. So not super complex once you've got that design and architecture down pat. So what we did then to kind of continue to build, get my slide to change here. We continue to build on that. So we've got scalability, right? So we took one thing and built on it, and took another thing and built on it. And so we continued to use kind of the same concepts and use them in new ways with the language. We did have a development site collection. That was another key for success. We had an area separate from the homepage where we could kind of try new things and experiment and not impact production. We gave them the documentation. They were able to go off and running on their own. So, you know, they didn't have to come back to that expensive consulting firm, right? You don't want to have to go back to them for everything. So handed that off, and they were able to do things on their own. We did have to know our audience. And we did find, when I say know your audience, know who is going to be using the site. And I'm going to hand this to Mark here to talk about lessons learned on that. But there's a key component here to knowing your audience and understanding the training piece, because we often kind of let training go because we've spent the money on the implementation. It looks great. And oh, the users, they'll be fine. They'll figure it out. But that's not always the case, right? So Mark, why don't you talk about kind of the bumpy road we had with some of those users?
Well, yeah, I think it's important to note that, you know, no implementation of this size is going to go without some lessons to be learned. And it turns out that, you know, every time we have a client, they like to talk about how they have unique problems. It's like, well, it turns out that everyone's suffering from a lot of the same unique problems. They're just unique to themselves. So as messed up as you think your organization may be, you're not the only one going through it. So you're definitely not alone in this. So some of the lessons we learned along the way, one of the things, one of the key things we learned was don't underestimate the value of training, right? We created this really easy to use document search site. And Stephanie, can you change the slide there?
Nope, sorry.
So we created this easy to use site, or at least we thought easy to use site, right? It's now like Amazon shopping. You click on a couple of things, you can filter on the documents, and you can type in what you're looking for and search for it. Easy to use. Well, it turns out that there were a couple of users who did not like the application, and we're like, well, why don't you like the application? They're like, well, I can't find anything I'm looking for. So we're like, what do you mean? So we jumped on the phone with them. We did a screen share with them, and they were totally making the application more complicated than they had to be because nobody had walked those couple people through how to use it. Like, they did not know that you could use a search box to find the document. They didn't know that those are what the refiners actually did, and they're the type of users who won't click around to try to figure things out. So as easy as you think something is, or even if you've trained the trainers, follow back up, make sure that training is being done, check in with the users and make sure they know how to use it, because the biggest difference between success and failure is getting those users engaged and making sure they understand how to use the applications. The other thing that you don't want to underestimate is the priority of those execs. Right? For me, it's always going to be those tiles for the landing page, which, again, as a developer, I don't need the pretty pictures, I just need it to work. But don't underestimate how important and impactful those little things can be to the executives who make the decisions, right? So listen to the feedback they have and take it into consideration. And don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to actually change a culture. This whole entire process took 3 years, I want to say, from the meeting to getting started to going through and pushing through the doors. And there were some times we would go a month or two, I think, without engagement when we were first starting out because it was that slow to get moving. So don't give up on your organization. If they're resistant, stay with it. Help them find that right key, and things can slowly change, but they can change. And the other thing that we learned through this is we could talk till we were blue in the face about how you could do things in SharePoint to make your life better. But what they really wanted to know, and what we really learned from this, is they wanted to know what are the industry standards and best practices for other people in their industry. If we could tell them that, then that was a big key to them having comfort with what we were presenting with them. Because change resistant, scared of the unknown, but you tell them, look, here's what your other people in your industry are doing, and it immediately calmed them down. So I highly recommend that when you're engaging these conversations, find out what other people are doing in the same industry, so you can give them that comfort level.
Yeah, and you really shouldn't underestimate the culture piece of it. In pieces of your business may move in different ways. You may have some that will adopt it very quickly. In this case, we had corporate who had no problem adopting the homepage, but then when it got out to the remote manufacturing plants, they wanted instructions on how to use the homepage. And we said, what? It's like MSN.com, right? You click on it, it loads a news article. It's no big deal. And they said, no, we don't understand. And what we didn't appreciate was the fact that many of these people don't sit at computers all day. Many of them in that remote area did not have regular internet access. They're not sitting at home on their couch browsing the internet and reading MSN.com. They really did need help on what they were supposed to do with that homepage. So for those of you who have, we're just now starting to reach the edges of our organizations, and many organizations have those manufacturing plants and field workers and people that don't sit at a computer all day. So that training component and knowing your audience and understanding them is so important to getting that user adoption that you're looking for. So Mark, what would you have done better?
Nothing. I'm perfect the way I am. No, I think the one of the biggest things you can kind of think about is, like, don't try to tackle all of this at once. It's okay to make small mistakes if you have the big picture in mind, right? Like, this is one of my favorite sayings: is fail fast but small, right? You can go in there and make mistakes and recover from them if you've got the big picture in mind. If you've got an understanding of SharePoint and Office 365 and those pieces, you can stop yourself from getting painted into the corner. So, which I think is one of the things that we really bring to the table, is the ability to stop yourself from being painted in the corner, even though things are changing every other month, right? Things are changing with all these new features coming out every week. It seems like someone moves your cheese like every day. And that can be a frustrating experience. It can be really frustrating to your users. So you kind of embrace that and don't panic when that change hits. I don't have anything else for that, Stephanie, do you?
Nope, I was just responding to a question here. You caught me on the fly. So what we did run into then, we got all this awesome stuff created and deployed, and the site looks great. And what we found then was that modern sites were released, and we're like, well, great, now what, right? But there's no reason to panic, because what we had was working, and classic sites aren't going away. And you may have been sitting here like, yeah, that's great, it's the classic site, what about modern? Well, use what you can. Right now, classic sites are your only choice for your root site collection. You could do a modern page on that classic site, but it still has the left side navigation, which a lot of people don't want for their root site homepage. So classic sites are still okay to use. Use what makes sense. And understand that if you roll something out and it's working, don't try to fix what isn't broken. Just keep forward, keep moving. and incorporate those new features as it makes sense. Because this group also did eventually implement teams and modern sites and groups and all of that as well. So it doesn't hold you back. Just understand that there's always going to be changes. There's always going to be things that you need to address, and you just keep moving forward. What's next? What's the next big project? And you know, we're kind of in a hybrid world right now. That's the reality of being in Office 365. We're going to do some things the old way. We're going to do some things the new way. And it's okay. It works like that, and it's good.
Good. Can I ask a question here? How important was mobile and responsive design in those intranet search pages that you had?
So we did end up designing a mobile responsive homepage that allowed them to get to the news that was posted on the homepage. So we did end up creating that. That was a phase. I believe that kind of came in between. That was after the rollout of the homepage and before the language implementation. So we did that. We also learned that if you do a mobile responsive page, that loading Yammer on that page dramatically slows your page load time down. So we ended up taking that off. We told them to use the Yammer app on mobile. So FYI to you guys, it's great in theory to have it all in one place, but that is something we did implement.
Yeah, because we found when we work with organizations that have a lot of field service or manufacturing floor type people, that a mobile or smartphone, they tend to use smartphones more than they would use a laptop. Like they kind of skipped over to desktop, laptop, right to mobile. So they're interacting with the whatever system through smartphones and mobile. And in fact, what you said about people not being familiar with MSN.com and all that, it's funny, they're actually probably more familiar with their smartphones because almost everyone has one of those these days and use that to interact with the internet. So they, that would be an important component for people who aren't used to desktops or laptops or don't use them to interact with the system, right? And that
Absolutely.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And, that's actually a great lead in to the next piece here. Mark's going to talk about the form that we created, the mobile form that we created for those manufacturing users. And exactly, that's, that was fantastic lead in, Scott. So Mark, I'll let you kind of get into the digital forms that we did and how they used them and how mobile played into that.
Yeah, so one of the big requirements they have in the manufacturing plants all over the world is that they had to do an audit of their machines twice a day. And that audit looks like this Excel spreadsheet that you see on the screen here. And it's a Excel spreadsheet. There's a lot of data to fill in. There's a lot of check boxes. And they didn't have an easy way of doing that from the plant floor because they didn't carry around their laptops, right? And they didn't have a nice way of doing that online. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to say, well, how can we take this spreadsheet and convert it into a form in SharePoint so they could easily go down there on their iPads and they could fill out the form in a nice, easy way. Plus, we'll now store all of that data in SharePoint so we can do metrics on the plants and their audits and how well those audits are going and make it very easy for them to use and also make it multilingual. So we thought this would be a great way to do that. So you may think though, how can you take this spreadsheet like this and even think about turning it into a form in SharePoint? So this was the challenge we faced. Spreadsheet.
You're going to do it in InfoPath, right?
I'm going to use InfoPath because I love InfoPath. Right. That's a lie. I hate InfoPath. People stop using InfoPath, okay? So what we did, if Stephanie will change slides for me, is we use this tool. Like I said, I created this tool called Stratus Forms, and it allows you to create forms in HTML. So I was able to go to my designer, Ryan, and I said, hey, Ryan, take this Excel spreadsheet, and I want you to turn it into an HTML form. I don't care about styling or anything, just make it look like an HTML form. So he took that spreadsheet that we just saw and he turned it into the web page that you're seeing here. So you can see we used big radio buttons so it'd be easy to fill out on an iPad or something. There's in the production one, there's like a date picker for date values. So they can now go through and have all these check boxes instead of that complicated Excel spreadsheet. And we're now storing all this data in SharePoint so that we can do analytics on it. And it's easier, much easier for these guys to go down onto the plant form and do it. It's also responsive. So if she resizes the size of her page here, you'll see that it will change in sizes. So it will fit on different size screens. Looks really good on mobile. And then using Stratus Forms, we were able to connect this up to SharePoint. And I think it took literally less than 20 minutes to make this form, once created in HTML, to work within SharePoint. And we were also able to use some multilingual features so that they could go in there and specify different labels for the fields in the form. And then depending on what language the user's account was set up as, would display the labels on the forms in their language that they could understand. So we got this rolled out to them. It worked great. And going back to Scott's question a while ago, one of the things we found out is that they were filling out this form on their phones. So they weren't even using tablets. They were using their phones to fill this out. And I'm like, I didn't even think it would look that great on the form, but they loved the way it looked on a phone. And that's how they fill out this form now. So they're doing these audits twice a day on the forms, collecting the data. And it's really gone a long way into helping them start to use SharePoint more in a real way that can really give them some real results on how those audits are going. And what ended up happening from this is that this became the impetus for us creating sites for each plant. So now that plants were starting to use SharePoint specifically for plant-specific information, it gave us a platform to say, now you need sites for your plants. So let's talk about what all the plants need and how we can get you storing other things in SharePoint for things like announcements, alerts for a plant, these documents, or other documents you need to store. So it's like we were able to take this one thing they needed, which was a form, and from that blow it up into now you've got sites for all of your different plants.
And Mark, there was a question about e-signatures as well. Did you want to touch on that, or do you, I know you have a blog on that you can share with the group as far as e-signatures go in combination with forms. Did you want to say anything about that? I know we're a little low on time here. But. So
yeah, so there is a feature in Stratus Forms that will basically create a writable text area on the screen, so you can actually just digitally sign something with your mouse or a pen or your finger on a touch screen, and it stores that as part of the form. So there is digital signature functionality built in for those who need that.
Awesome. Okay.
So yeah, so it took us, what, 2 going on 3 years, but at the end of all this, we now had, even executives that were invested and excited about this. That CEO video, I mean, we've mentioned that a few times, but it's just, they were so thrilled with that. It was kind of mind-blowing. We've got global communications with the multilingual sites and the plant sites. The plant workers are engaged. Now they're filling out those forms. They've got improved collaboration throughout the organization, and it's really opened the door to more and more and more projects.
I'm trying to get it to switch. There it goes. Sorry,
no, Stephanie, if you want to go ahead. I want to quickly talk through these things on the list, Stephanie, since
yeah, sure.
You put this
so
together.
I'll let you answer questions here. So with the different projects and applications that started, things really took off, right? So we, as I mentioned earlier, we added the mobile access to the news and announcements. We ended up rolling out regional based home pages. That's where the audits ended up being stored, and there was a question there on the Q&A. Those audit metrics were rolled up into Power BI. So that's the other benefit of having that information in a list format submitted from any kind of form, whether it's Stratus Forms or Power Apps or whatever you're using. You can roll that information up into Power BI, get your metrics, and get your dashboards from that stuff. So pretty cool stuff they were doing there. And we actually handed that off to their BI team, and their BI team took care of that for them. We rolled out Yammer. That was also part of that communications initiative. So that kind of got rolled out at the same time as their intranet homepage, doing things like HR, being able to communicate during, benefits enrollment and being able to answer questions, things like that. We did the mobile audit forms that Mark just talked you through, Power BI dashboards for audits, Microsoft Teams and groups. I referenced that earlier as well. They had joint venture companies that were not able to come into their intranet to see, everything, but they could share certain pieces of their content documentation with those groups. So they created, in their case, it was Office groups that they did the external sharing with. External sharing is brand new with Microsoft Teams. There's some things there to be aware of. But that was their way of finding smaller breakout groups with collaboration. And I just recently wrote an article on how to modernize your site architecture. So for those that aren't familiar, SharePoint is a fantastic place for communications, and your modern communication sites, definitely replacing intranets that way. But we're seeing a really strong shift into using teams and groups for collaboration, because typically you're not just sharing documents, right? You're having conversations, you're tracking task lists, you have all these other features that are part of the Office 365 stack that get created when you create a group or a team. And so this global manufacturing company found that they were starting to replace things, right? So instead of WebEx, they have Skype conferencing. Instead of Trello, they're using Planner. There's instead of smart sheets, they're using Excel and lists in SharePoint. So as they start knocking all these things off one by one, they were also creating budget for more and more projects in Office 365, which was just a really neat thing to see. So rights management also came into play with those joint venture companies. Rights management, they lock things down so that people couldn't download documents out of the SharePoint site. They didn't want them sending them off to competitors, so they could view the document, but they couldn't download it. I think there were some sites too, they could download, but if they emailed it to someone, then you couldn't log into it unless you had the right credentials, things like that came into play. Their research and development team migrated into SharePoint, so that site got locked down. There's a whole lot there that they were doing around that. Skype for Business, as I mentioned, that replaced WebEx in a lot of cases. They were doing instant messaging. If you're not familiar, Skype is getting rolled into Teams. So little nugget of info for you there. The Surface Hub, they were using that for collaboration globally on engineering drawings. They can now hop into a Skype meeting, use the Surface Hub, and be able to manipulate those 3D drawings and talk about things and work through them. So that was a big thing for them too. And then right at the end, they were doing a Microsoft project trial, so Project Online, as it relates to all of their PMO across the organization, and being able to do large-scale project tracking and resourcing. So you talk about someone who started not even being sure intranet versus internet, someone who had legacy applications, their intranet site looked like it was from the 80s, that was a bunch of links on a page, to doing all of this. 3 years is not that long of a time to transform to the point that they were maximizing their utilization in Office 365. They went a long way, and I think the latest thing I heard, they were looking at upgrading from E3 into E5, and so now they can get into a whole another realm of e-discovery and the voice over IP, replacing all of their phones, that sort of thing. So they're still looking to do even more. So pretty cool transformation in that organization.
Yeah, that's amazing. How much you got your foot in the door and went from there, huh? It just went like crazy.
You built roots, right?
But I was going to ask, all along the line, were they asking about cost benefit? Were you having to justify the cost? I mean, obviously you have to justify it, but were you doing like spreadsheets and detailed? I mean, it's hard to always quantify the benefits gained in direct numbers, right?
Oh yeah, Scott, I have to tell you, being a technical person, like I was raised by accountants, right? So I'm familiar with budgets and spreadsheets and all of that, and it really came in handy because we did spend a lot of time saying, how much are we investing and where does that go? And, there are some things like Skype and replacing WebEx, huge savings, right? But sometimes you have a process in SharePoint that you may not necessarily have a cost savings around. What's the value of having someone fill out an audit that when they're right in front of the machine versus having to note something down and go back to a computer? There's a time savings, there's an accuracy improvement that, sometimes those things don't necessarily show up on a budget sheet. You just kind of know things are getting better and they're more efficient. Ultimately, that builds into less mistakes, right? Better quality.
Right.
What's the cost of poor quality, right? So the COPQ thing, that was a whole other thing we looked into for them. So yeah, I mean, that was a big part of this, was trying to help them figure out, how do I prove my value on this project?
Right, right. And like you say, you can't really get to exact numbers some of the time, because how do you know what that process really costs versus the improved process? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I thought we had a really good question in here that I'm going to address. If I'm not a decision maker, how can I help our company move forward? I'm a huge fan of grassroots level efforts. Even if you're not in the position to pull in a consultant, even if you're not in a position to do a company-wide implementation, right? We have another company right now, they're global too, but they're a bunch of joint venture companies working together. And so they don't actually have top-down support because they've said, you're all joint ventures, we can't force you to do anything like the parent company, right? So we kind of talked about that lead by example. Go out and do cool stuff. And then everybody will be looking over your shoulder like, hey, how'd you do that? What'd you do? So kind of building that curiosity, and then go talk about the cool stuff you've implemented. Do what you have access to. And sometimes that's reading, blogs. Maybe it's going out to techcommunity.microsoft.com and finding out what the latest updates are. Maybe that's watching YouTube and implementing something on your own. There's a lot of things that you can do, even if you're not in a decision-making position, to do basic, if you can get basic rights in SharePoint and Office 365, there's still a lot of stuff that you can do on your own. So hopefully that, yes, and Mark, I'm sure that comment's from Mark.
Yeah,
I can't
absolutely.
tell.
Come to Branson.
Yes, come to Branson, or go to an event, go to a SharePoint event and find out what's going on. Just like SharePoint-A-Loozar, the North American Collab Summit, there's a lot of good conferences. And if you don't have the budget for the big one, look for SharePoint Saturdays. There's a lot of really good stuff happening in your local town that you may not even know about. SharePoint user groups, SharePoint Saturdays, stuff like that. So definitely go looking for that.
There's also the big conference in Vegas at the end of May.
Yes.
That's supposedly the big sort of Microsoft running it, but not exactly conference in May. Yeah, so it should be really huge.
SharePointNA.com, that's the conference in May that Scott's referring to. That is SharePoint conference, kind of the replacement for the SPC of old. For those of you that have been around SharePoint for a while, we used to have our own conference for Microsoft. They're sort of bringing that back coming up here in May. There'll be a lot of good speakers at that as well, if you can't make it to Branson, so lots of options there.
$3,000 versus $32, I'm just saying.
Yeah, and the SharePoint Saturdays are free, so that's a lower cost. No,
but the SharePoint conference in Vegas, it's kind of, they're really trying to bring back the SharePoint conference, and it's a big Microsoft focus. Most of the product team is going to be there, so it's going to be very much focused on what's new, what's coming, and if you really want to be on the cutting edge of SharePoint and know what's out there and what's coming, then it's a great conference to attend.
Right, and Crow Canyon is a gold sponsor of Branson and of the Vegas conference, so we'll be there with our stuff too.
You guys will be all over the place. We'll be hanging out a lot, Scott.
Yeah, we gotta have some fun with SharePoint and Office 365. It doesn't all work, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Well, I know we're over time here, so I just wanted to wrap up quick. But no matter what, get the right help for it. Don't be afraid to push back if you see something that isn't going quite right. Find a partner if you are looking for partner consulting firms, etc. Crow Canyon, Pate Group, we are here to help you guys. And just remember, you don't have to do all of this at once. This group, it took them the better part of 3 years to get where they are now. So definitely appreciate all of you guys joining today and listening to our story. I see quite a few of you are still on, so appreciate you sticking with us even after 3 o'clock here.
All right. Well, thank you, Stephanie and Mark, and great webinar. We'll have a recording and some results from this, and we'll follow up email and let people know. But thank you, everyone, and have a good day.